Cool. So welcome to our final debate, and we are going to have Krithik, who is pro and second speaker, versus Iris, who is con and first speaker. Everyone have the cases open. I'll give you 30 more seconds to get the cases open, and we will start. Iris, let me know when you have the case open and ready to go.
Yeah, and our time. So I will go now. 3, 2, 1, started. Correlate affirm resolve the benefits of the International Monetary Fund outweigh the harms. We negate. Contention 1 is neocolonialism. First, the IMF is strictly a colonialist. Only 20 neocolonist is taking over the resources under the quest of the offering help, and the IMF designed by West keeps the voting rights allocated according to the capital contributed. As a result, USA has almost 20%, while 47 African countries hold only 7%. This gives developed countries powers to set unfavorable conditions. Countries are forced to accept it. And second, this leads to loan conditions that benefit only the West, only 20. During the 1980s, IMF recommended the U.S. military in the Haiti for benefit of the U.S. geopolitical interest, and foreign business received electricity subsidies while local business could not. By the IMF, this shows the neocolonialism of the held by the IMF. And third, empirical evidence confirms. Ronald writing 2008, for 107 IMF countries over 1990 to 2003, controlling for the economic determinants and geopolitical considerations shaped IMF lead decisions affecting effectiveness. Fourth, the judge has a moral obligation to reject neocolonialism. Mark writing 2017, communities where the moral obligations would be response and would defeat the neocolonialism instead of waiting on the IMF. And to save the people, citizens fight their own battles. And finally, neocolonialism makes war and poverty inevitable. Bruno writing 2018. Pastors facing the social issues which have to face it before the World War or the poverty resolved, giving independence to be followed by aid prevented actual development. So our second contention is the inequality. First, IMF conditions on loans increase inequality. Long writing 2020s, the IMF stops interest push for longer programs, longer loans, and more conditionalities than the optimal staff's ideological benefits, and the quarantines bats and repayments cuts the public spendings, liberalizing trade and less regulated labor markets, lower tax and privatizations. And 70% of the programs include conditions on the liberalizations. It's in some IMF conditions increase inequality compared to counterfactual scenario without IMF influence. Second, empirical evidence confirms non-writing 2020 data covered from 1973 to 2013 and from 155 countries. IMF programs increased Gini coefficients by the 1 point and equivalent to the 5% of the poor half means incomes to the richer half. And third, incomes inequality makes the financial crisis inevitable. Group writing 2014, 14 countries over the 120 years, inequality is root cause of the financial crisis, and inequality determines critics booms and the financial crisis. There was no way around the inequality in the long run. This ends with high household leverage and several financial fragilities and serious microeconomic volatility. And this is time.
Okay, Krithik, ready to begin?
My time begins now. Contention 1 is RFAs or regional financial arrangements. First, loans are inevitable. The benefit of IMF loans is it prevents RFA loans. Heading 20. If US refuse to fund, countries will build alternative RFAs. A world of regional monetary funds would displace it. Second, RFAs make their contentions inevitable. Masters 20. IMF is identified with hardship because only in crisis services are sought. Evaluating is difficult. We cannot reliably know whether the consequences of IMF policies were worse than the alternative. Third, RFAs will also use conditional loans. La Hotellerie follows 18. RFAs have conditions, and ESM, EFSD, and AMF all require conditionality as a prerequisite. CMIM and CRA outsource by requiring IMF program. Contention 2 is surveillance. First, IMF surveillance improves global financial stability. Lombardi 08. In a world buffeted by crises, IMF exists to promote international financial stability. A key tool is surveillance. IMF is in a unique position to pool data gathered from its universal membership info provided, produce social pressures which influence a government to adopt international norms. Second, empirical evidence confirms Dreher 10. Data for 68 countries over 1975 to 2002. IMF surveillance might be more important than lending and conditionality. IMF programs reduce crisis risk by 0.2 percentage points and is statistically significant. Third, each currency crisis pushes 120 million into poverty. Ravalian 09. Impacts of East Asia crisis. The crisis will increase the poverty count to 120 million more under $2 a day. Fourth, currency crisis make austerity inevitable. Malanen 16. Sovereign default lead to capital market exclusions. This leaves government to live by its means. Governments need to self-impose austerity. Finally, RFAs only make this worse. Somanen 10. A divorce between the IMF and regional would risk global financial stability. Relying on regionalism alone would forego benefits unique to the IMF. Surveillance is something regional funds cannot replicate. Finally, we'll quantify the difference. Porter 17 suggests when collaboration suggests when both the fund and RFAs are involved, countries affected is reduced relative independently. Using 62 economies, countries affected by initial shock. Global RFA only 13, fund plus RFA 5.
What time, Krithik?
IMF has better surveillance. La
Yep.
Hotellerie follows 18. IMF's other core functions are conducting surveillance, and under surveillance, IMF monitors economies and provides policy advice. Fund surveillance takes the form of a regular bilateral exchange known as consultation. Surveillance involves monitoring and analyzing trends. RFAs have far less sophisticated capabilities for surveillance or none at all. No RFA can compares to the IMF in its range of tasks, expertise, and experience. AMRL has never been tested, leaving its actual crisis prevention and crisis resolution capabilities unexplored. My time ends.
Okay, crossfire begins now.
May I have the first question?
Yes.
So for the first condition, our topic, our resolution is talk about IMF while you bring the RFAs.
Well, so the reason we can use RFAs in this debate is, as we said in our RFAs convention, evaluating the IMF is difficult because it's only called for in times of crisis. So by comparing it with the RFA, we can sort of frame how well the IMF does its job. I'll take a question. So when you on contention 1 for neocolonialism, you guys say that the judge should reject neocolonialism. So do you want the judge to reject any kind of colonialism, or do we just choose what is the least colonialist in this debate?
First, IMF colonialism is harmful, and we said that the biggest impact for the IMF colonialism is actually it caused more people to suffering and into the poverty. So this is why judge have the obligation, a moral obligation to reject the neocolonialism in this topic.
Okay, so a quick follow-up. So if another organization like maybe RFAs or the World Bank or maybe even the WHO, but if any other organization is also colonialist in a similar way, will we also reject those?
First, you are talking about other agencies, but we are talking about IMF. Whether IMF is benefit or worse, and we said that IMF is harmful because it is colonialist. So this is why judge should vote for reject the new colonialisms. And the other agency is out of topic, so we don't need to discuss that. May I ask a question? So for your second contentions, what can actually the IMF do by the surveillance? Can they control the policy of the country?
Yes, our link explains how they control each country because by producing social pressures, since the countries kind of have to follow the international
So they give the
norms.
country the social pressures by conditionality?
What is conditionality? Our whole contention is about surveillance, so we don't need to
Yeah,
bring
so how can
conditionality.
surveillance control the country's policy? They just give the advice, right?
And surveillance has nothing to do with conditionality.
So they have no conditionality. How can they give the country, control the country's policy?
They set norms that
Hi,
all
that is
countries should
time.
follow.
Prep time?
I need prep time.
Prep time has started.
Okay. It is 1 minute, and my roadmap will be go over their both contentions and time starting now. So first, in response to their first contentions RFAs, first, no links resolutions are asked what's the cost and benefits with the IMF. RFAs has nothing to do with the resolutions. Second, RFAs has better conditions. Our conditions only link to the IMF. And Rizzo writing 2010, rescue quota have greater local knowledge of the regional economic, yet may be less willing to impose the strict conditionalities than the IMF and the regionalizations. And second, RFA solves $2.5 trillion in lending capabilities. Venture writing 2020, for a long time, the IMF was the only available financing RFA's emergence as the alternative sources, and the EFSD and the CMM were enlarged in the response to 2009 crisis today, and the current GFS and capability summed up to $3.5 trillion. And three, without the IMF, the numbers would be significantly higher. Green writing 2019 accounts takes the existing configurations of the RFAs that takes the discount the accumulations of the gradual changes and the ways RFAs may borders the governments. And fourth, RFA solves the currency crisis better. Mark writing 2010s. RFAs have the advantage. RFA have the superior information about an economies in crisis and enacts more quickly. Their lengthy decisions and RFA contribute to global stability by promoting for a put your own house in order strategy at a regional levels as well as through improving countries and regional surveillance. This might reduce more hazards. And fifth, RFAs are inevitable. There's writing 2010s regionalization is inevitable because financing regionalism is demanded by the emerging markets economy because of the diminished relevance. And then go over their second contention about surveillance. First, actually, they didn't give us actually what surveillance will do to the countries. They only said that surveillance will give the advice. So actually, surveillance will do nothing to the currency crisis. And second, the IMF surveillance is colonialist. Mark writing 2007, the surveillance rules of the IMF is subjected to the political influence. The behavior of the governments following the Articles IV's constellations and appears different. This appears to be a political bias as the serving spread of the EME displayed by the 1520s. If it has an positive voting correlations with the USA. Findings are robust and virus extensions and modifications. IMF is favors those countries with the political powers amounts to that increase of the sovereign spread by the 13 to 14 billions due to the effects of the degradations of the microeconomic fundamental and financing conditions. And third, don't believe the claims that IMF have reformed. Writing 2019, multiple reforms obscures actual the practice of the programs. The found conditionality through the enforced country narrowly of the policy on the in-depth countries. IMF reform to do little improve the equabilities of decision-making power. It's time.
Prep time?
I need 10 seconds.
Tell me when to stop.
Okay, that's time. Off-time roadmap, frontlining, and then their case. My time begins now. So they say first no link. The resolution does not require us to talk about RFAs. So we concede this defense. So we agree that we will frame the debate around the IMF only. So turns 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 do not apply anymore. Next on to surveillance. They say we don't know what surveillance will do, and this means that it won't even help global financial crises. However, we give a clear warrant of social pressures influence the country's policies, such as their social policies, which will lead to many material impacts, such as economic increase and overall better life. They say IMF surveillance is colonialist, but the IMF is the best of the worst. Some defense against currency crisis is better than none. They say don't believe IMF reform, but IMF has in fact reformed with less conditions and better social plans. Their contention one is neocolonialism. We have 5 responses to this. First, IMF may not be perfect, but the alternatives are worse. 1020, due to international relations in the real world where nations constantly battle for hegemony, tensions affect decisions. Ceteris paribus, the IMF is the most representative financial institution in the world merely due to its greater membership count. This is something that RFAs simply could not achieve. Two, or actually ignore the RFAs. Two, IMF surveillance solves their link as surveillance ensures the IMF can track the economic status of all countries and therefore have their ability to adjust their voting quota accordingly. 3, financial crises increase colonialism. They impact poor countries more and create opportunities for rich multinationals to buy off domestic industries and extract resources. 4, financial crises cause war and poverty. Bad economic conditions drives countries into poverty, impossible rebellions and attack because of distrust in government by citizens. 5, World Bank is an alternate cause. 10, 20, other financial institutions hold similar limitations. World Bank voting power is proportionate to capital stock. President of World Bank comes from the U.S. Both were created at Bretton Woods. They say contention 2 is inequality. We have 3 responses to this. 1, weigh our link on surveillance over their link on conditional, since surveillance is unique to the IMF and actually is guaranteed to improve global financial stability. 2, IMF reform, PRGT loans decrease income inequality. Proposal 17, fund provides PRGT, which carries an interest rate of 0 since 2010. Over half of the fund arrangements involved PRGT. PRGT supported programs safeguard spending on poor and vulnerable groups. Programs shift expenditures towards social programs. PRGT programs target a rise in public spending by 15%. Using data on 86 low and middle income countries for 2000 to 2009, poverty alleviation program leads to a decrease in poverty. Post-2000 IMF programs are found to have an income inequality decreasing effect. This is one of the many programs that IMF implemented that shows that they have reformed or are making better social programs. Third, IMF conditions advance progressive taxes, decrease inequality. Taylor 19, IMF has long advocated progressive tax policies, namely one of the 3 key methods for tackling inequality. Suggested that social spending policies had a part to play, noticing that allocating funds to areas such as education, healthcare, and pensions can help to reduce wealth inequality. That is my time.
All right, cross.
So in your rebuttal, you talk about IMF PRGT program. So why it is, so does it have the conditionalities, or it can basically give the money and asking for no back?
PRGT is not a conditionality, really. It's one of those social programs that IMF created that actually helps countries progress. So you could say in a way it's part of these it's one of the programs that the IMF puts into like their sort of social pressure. So it's like one of their policies in a way that actually help these countries. And basically that whole card was going over how they're helping countries. I'll take a question. So why should we weigh conditionality over IMF surveillance?
Because IMF's conditionality do more harms than their helps. And also, your contention surveillance is only based on your said social pressures, but IMF is a lending organization, money lending organizations. They actually do nothing to the country's norms and policy.
Just to quickly answer that, the IMF, as we went over, had 3 major things. One of them is conditionality, which is something a lot of different institutions have, as we can agree. But one of the things that makes the IMF unique is this surveillance. So we're weighing the uniqueness of surveillance to IMF to say that's important. You can take another question.
Okay, also, you talk about IMF. What's your response for the colonialism? Because you have the contention about like World Bank outcasts, but you said we should bring the alternative out of the topic, right?
So to answer that, yes, we provided the World Bank as sort of a follow-up to our first card on that. We said the IMF may not be perfect, but the alternatives are worse. Basically, we're weighing the IMF as we specifically only talk about the IMF in this card. It says that the IMF is the most representative financial institution, which means that despite what your reasoning for colonialism, it's still more representative than anything else. Therefore, we should weigh that over.
So you think that we shouldn't bring the alternative out of the topic?
Okay, but we don't talk about alternatives in the card specifically.
But your cards no longer apply, right? You compare IMF with the alternative, but we are talking about whether IMF is good or not.
You guys say the IMF is colonialist, and then you also prohibit us from saying that we're not allowed to compare it to another colonialist organization. How can we, as we said, how can we say the IMF is better or
All
not
right, that is
in terms of
time.
colonialism?
Prep time, Iris?
Yeah.
Okay, you have 2 minutes starting now.
Okay. So my roadmap will be cover our case, weighing and extend our case and their case, and time starting now. First, extend our first contention, neocolonialisms. Holding 20 says IMF voting and quota is rigid in favor of the West, and Holding 20 also says that this ensures biased conditions like inheritance. And Real writing 2008 studies 107 IMF countries and confirms this is geopolitical, and the way neocolonialism's way a mark a aesthetic mark countries 17 says judge has a moral obligation to reject neocolonialism, and the individual rejection is only ways to actual defeated. And B causalities. Bruno writing 2018 says neocolonialism makes war and poverty inevitable, and ensure IMF aid helps fails, and reject, and our framing is that I'm sold writing 2019 said utilitarianism is impossible between we can never truly know future consequence, and neocolonialism manipulate data to justify worldwide poverties, and we drop our second contention in inequality because we firms we negate that inequality is inevitable because of the multiple atom technology improve by the social society. And also go over what they said. First, they talk about alternative awards, but we said but they already agree that we should bring the alternative out of the topic. So even if they compare the IMF with the other organizations that is out of the resolutions, so that means that they have no response to our neocolonialism topic. And also they said IMF surveillance will solve, but actually we said that IMF surveillance extends neocolonialism. IMF surveillance is neocolonialist, right? By Friends writing 2007, IMF surveillance is neocolonialist because according to his study, IMF is in favoring those countries whose political powers and amounts to increase of sovereign spread by 30 to 40, and also extend IMF. And also that means that IMF is a colonial sense. That means that more people will going to the property by IMF, and also extends the also extends IMF hasn't reformed because Green 19 says that even if they claim IMF have better conditionality in their programs, but you can't believe that because IMF structurally is still colonialism because voting power still didn't change. So that means that even if they have better conditionality, that means nothing.
Okay, that is time. Krithik, would you like prep time? Beginning now. Tell me when to stop.
Okay. Um, Uptime roadmap. Weighing our case, their case. My time begins now. First, extends surveillance. Somanen 10 says only IMF surveillance creates the info sharing necessary for countries to avoid currency crises. Dreher 10 quantifies this as a 0.2 percentage point difference. This outweighs on a magnitude. Ravalion 09 says each currency crisis pushes 120 million into poverty, which is by far the biggest impact in this round. B. Casualty Molinen 16 says currency crises cause sovereign defaults, which force government austerity inevitably. Next, on to our case. They say IMF surveillance is neo-colonialist. However, surveillance has nothing to do with colonialism. As they have said, the only thing that they say is colonialist is voting quota. They never talk about surveillance specifically being colonialist. Next, they say the IMF hasn't reformed, but we give specific examples of there being new programs. So, and next, the voting quota doesn't really matter because any organization, as we have mentioned, has such as a similar method of distributing voting. Next, onto their case, extend alternates worse. They say or extend alternates worse. Basically, the IMF is the most representative financial institution in the world because it has a greater membership count, and this is less neo-colonialist than its other institutions. And they say this is out of the resolution. However, this card is not out of the resolution as well. In context, it may be talking about the alternatives. The card specifically is talking about the IMF, so we cannot say the card is out of the resolution. Next, they drop inequality. However, they didn't concede any defense specifically on it. So extend PRGT loans. They're an example of one of the many social programs the IMF created that help countries significantly, as the data showed. Since my opponent does not cleanly concede any defense on or inequality, we have to assume these PRGT loans are true, which means the IMF is reforming and they're creating better loans, which means that they are less colonialist than any of their anything else, and therefore the best option in this round. For these reasons, we urge an affirmative vote.
Let's do Grand Cross, starting now.
So your extends alternative are worse, but that still compares the IMF with the others organization, right?
So this is why at the start of the debate, I in our first crossfire I asked, are we going to be comparing the IMF? Are you going to be rejecting outright any sort of colonialism or are we going to be choosing the organization that is less colonialist? Because if we're looking at what is less colonialist, we have because we still need some kind of
To this
institution.
topic, we negate that we should reject colonialism.
Okay, in that case, how do you plan on solving global financial stability? Because the IMF is currently the only solution really to stop it.
The
If we take
IMF
out
hurts the
any
global financial
organization,
stability because it is colonialism.
but if we take out any so if we take out any sort of institution, that means all of our material impacts are going to happen, which means we're going to be pushing 120 million into poverty. So are you really going to weigh one organization over 120 million going into poverty, which affects the livelihoods of
First,
many?
your contention about financial stability is because of the financial stability pushing 100 millions into poverty, but neocolonialism, it will cause more people into the poverty, and it will also cause the financial stability.
I
So,
believe you have no material impact though.
but we extend that IMF is colonialism and
You guys extend
and
morality
burn.
and
Bruno 18 says that neocolonialism make wars and poverty inevitable and ensures the IMF aids fails.
okay, but that's dependent on conditionals, which are equally bad. I'll take the next question. So you guys haven't really responded to PRGT loans at all because you guys saying the IMF hasn't reformed really at all. However, PRGT loans are a really clear example of this. So why do we not think the IMF has reformed still?
First, we said that we negate that equal income inequality is inevitable. And second, PRGT loans is the programs by IMF, but IMF colonialism is way out important and it helps because it calls more people into poverty.
I think that's
Okay, that is time. There's 1 minute of prep time left, Iris, starting now. All right, that is prep time.
Okay, so my roadmap will be weighings and our case and their case and time starting now. So still extend the new colonialism. So Holy 20 said the IMF voting quota is rigid in favor of the West, and Holy 20 also says this ensures the bias conditions like the Hellies, and it will cause the will make Bruno 18 says that neocolonialism makes the war and poverty inevitable and ensures all the IMF programs aid fails. And also we also win on our framework because Bruno 19 says utility is impossible between we can never truly know the future consequence and the neocolonists manipulate the data to justify worldwide poverties. So even if our my opponents brings the counter framework in his final focus, that can't work because he dropped it. And also they said that alternative is worse. Their only response to our condition is an alternative or worse. But he already said that we agree with that. We should bring all the alternative out of the topic. So even if they compare IMF with alternatives, that means nothing. And also they said their card is specific to IMF, but actually their card is compare IMF with alternative. And they also said we drop inequality because we said we negate that inequality is worldwide inequality is inevitable. And also they talk about the PRGT program. They said they can stop the financial stability, they can keep the financial stability. But actually we said the IMF neocolonialism makes war and poverty inevitable. That ensures that all the IMF aids fails. That means that even if they have the PRGT program, that will fail because the IMF is still colonialism. More people will go into the poverty and the war will happen. And extend IMF surveillance is colonialist. They said we didn't set our surveillance is specific to the neocolonialism, but still we said the IMF favoring those countries with the political powers constitute an increase of the silver spread by the 30 to 40. And it's time.
1 minute of prep time starting now. All right, that is time.
Okay, so off-turn roadmap, weighing our case, their case. My time begins now. Extend surveillance. Soman and 10 says only IMF surveillance creates the info sharing necessary for countries to avoid currency crises. Dreher 10 quantifies this as a 0.2 percentage point difference. This outweighs on A magnitude. Ravel Leon 09 says each currency crisis pushes 120 million into poverty. And B casualty. Malanen 16 says currency crises cause sovereign defaults which force government austerity inevitably. We weigh on first magnitude because 120 million is the biggest impact this round. Weigh on this, we weigh inequality over their colonialism because what matters more, millions of lives or one organization, Judge? They are now onto our case. They say IMF surveillance is colonialist, but as we said, surveillance has nothing to do with colonialism. The only thing they say is colonialist is voting quota. So we cannot say, we can't assume anything in this card because it's purely theoretical and they provide no data on how surveillance is specifically being colonialist. Next, on to their case, extend alternatives worse. The IMF is the most representative organization out of all the financial institutions, meaning it is the least colonialist. They say that we can't talk about other organizations. While we did concede the RFA's I believe their first point to our rebuttal on RFAs, we still have to compare in some sort of way. As long as we focus the card on the IMF, we should be still able to compare as we need to sort of frame the IMF in a way that it's better. Also, she cannot extend inequality in her speech because she conceded it in rebuttal without conceding the defense, which means we can still answer her turns over her. So extend PRGT loans. They are an example of one of the many social programs that IMF created that help countries significantly as the data showed. We should weigh these inequality over
And that is time.
colonialism.
That was a fantastic debate. Everyone be sure to vote, and we're going to go ahead and talk about it.